it's like, I'm going to spend half an hour just reminding myself of all the things I like about serial fiction.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, yeah, it's the kind of subject that you can really just fall into, you know? Like it just there's no end to it. You can just keep going back and back and back when it comes to the history of that stuff. So,
Yeah.
storytelling is
Yeah,
endlessly fascinating.
exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think in later chats, we'll get into uh, the nuts and bolts of how you do it, or how we do it at least. But yeah, I was trying to thinking, like, how did I end up getting into writing serial fiction? I think for
Hmm.
me, it was kind of by accident. It was meant to be this like one-off 6-chapter experiment thing. I didn't really
Right.
think about it from in like a formative way, I suppose. And then like 11 years later, I'm still doing it. Um, but yeah, but like, how did you like get into doing it yourself?
I mean, so what's interesting is I I thought that Substack was my first experience with serials, but it actually
Mm.
started in high school. My friends and I had a private forum. It was just like 6 or 7 of us, and we would just post stories to each other, and we would split them up into pieces, right? And it was genuinely serial fiction, just, a couple of high school girls writing stories to each other. And it was I mean, when it was an audience of 6 or 7 and all of them are your friends, there's no like reader feedback going on. Um, but I mean, that was my first experience with it. And then for years, I think like a lot of writers, I sort of toiled under the assumption that if I was going to be writing something, I had to write the whole thing and then I had to publish it somehow, you know.
Yeah, the one
Um,
true way of writing a book.
the one true way. There can only be one.
Yeah.
Um, and thankfully, coming to Substack, I was on Substack for a year doing nonfiction because it was sort of a holdover from my Instagram presence until I started meeting fiction writers here and going, oh, that's a thing people are doing. People are doing fiction here. Um, and I forget who it was. There's an interview I watched where someone was talking about the history of serial fiction. And that actually sealed it for me, was thinking about like, oh, this isn't a new thing. Like, I don't know why I thought it was like a newfangled idea to post your work
Yeah.
in pieces. It's not. It's just been around forever, you know. Um, yeah, so Ivy and Ichthos, which, I'll plug it since it's sitting right here, but my first serial on Substack, um, that was my first time seriously serializing. So, yeah, that was 2023.
2023, nice. Yeah, so I'd been on Substack for a couple of years. By that point, I think, which is very much very Wild West back then. Um, and then I'd been
Yeah,
doing Wattpad for since 2015 or thereabouts. So that's why
right.
I kind of stumbled into it in the first place, and then discovered I really enjoyed it, and it actually helped me just write consistently.
Yeah.
Because I think it started off as a kind of productivity hack, and then
Yeah.
it was like after that when I was like, oh, this is actually helping me write. And then I was like discovering that I actually really enjoyed the structure and the form of it as well. So even once I built a writing habit, I still prefer to write in a serial form and publishing it
Yeah.
week by week. Hence, when I tried to write a short story recently, I found it very stressful and strange because it was
Yeah.
just this one piece and there's no particular deadline, and I didn't like it. It felt very chaotic.
Yeah. Writing without the adrenaline. It's something I'd like to try. I'd like to try writing without that feeling and see if I can do it. Because I think I've enjoyed, I think I did a count recently. I'm up to 9 serials on Substack, I think.
Yeah, you've done loads.
But
It's
that's
because
because
you're
I keep
disciplined
them
and you,
relatively short
yeah.
though. um, but I mean, yeah, that's been my pattern, has been to write week to week with the adrenaline pushing me every step of the way and knowing that people are waiting for the next installment. And it's kind of like, what if I tried writing in secret? Could I still do that? I don't know. I don't know if I have it
Yeah.
in me, but
Uh,
I'd like to try.
yeah, I'm pretty sure I would not be able to write a novel just under my own steam, like quietly by myself. I don't
Yeah.
think my brain just wouldn't do it. I have to, even if it's just like one random person reading, like that's enough. But I
Sure.
need that just to like keep me ticking over. Otherwise, yeah, my brain just drifts away. Doesn't so much lose interest in the thing I'm doing, as in it gets distracted by other things I want to do. Whereas with a serial, once you're started, you kind of have to finish it. You feel obliged because otherwise it would be rude. So
Well, and also, I think, I don't know about you, but what happens to me too is that if I don't have someone, even if they don't know it, someone driving me from behind to get the thing done, I will get hung up on a piece of the puzzle that doesn't fit anymore. The nice thing about serials is you have to make the puzzle piece fit somehow to finish it. Like, you
yeah,
have to keep going. And I think that's where I tend to lose steam when I'm alone, is that if
hmm
there's something missing, it doesn't feel like I have the impetus to, like, really finish and, like, get through it somehow or make it work, or, it's like with a serial, it's gonna be like, "Well, oh, well, I gotta keep going." Like, I
yeah,
can't stop
exactly.
and ruminate on this for ages.
Yeah, so you're like snapping the puzzle piece and cutting it up into weird shapes, and just like,
Yep.
oh, that'll fit now. That'd be fine.
It's Apollo 13. It's just, like, duct tape and
yeah,
sticking things it's like,
exactly.
"Ah." Yeah,
Yeah, you
exactly.
just need like you need that Ed Harris character who's just like making it all happen in the background.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
right. Well, hello to everyone who's popped up already. I see Scoot is making himself known in the chat as always. Hello, Scoot. So this is the first of hopefully a bunch of uh, chats about serial fiction. As John Ward pointed out earlier, we are serializing our conversations about serial fiction, which is sort of accidental, but I guess that's just how
The
our brains
medium is
work.
the message.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Uh, so yes, today we're going to just chat about serial fiction itself and sort of what it is and isn't and where it came from. Not in like tons of detail, but I'm certainly not a historian or anything. It's just the way I understand it, having been doing it for a while and curious about where it came from. Um, and then in subsequent chats like this, we will get into the nuts and bolts of initially how you sort of plan and prep to put the serial together, then the actual writing process and the publishing process, which inevitably we'll talk quite a lot about how to do it on Substack because that's where we do it. But we'll hopefully try and keep it like broad enough that it will apply to people doing it elsewhere as well. And then down the line, we'll talk about how you keep going and actually like finish a serial and also find readers, which is quite an important piece of the puzzle. That's the plan. But yes, today we're just going to chat about serials in general and what is serial fiction. Uh, and as with all these things, it can sort of be a million things. So we're not trying to like lay down the law. This is very much like what we think it is and what it is to us. And also, we haven't really discussed this ahead of time, so we could end up completely disagreeing with each other, which would be quite exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. The start of
uh,
a beef.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So one thing I wanted to do was talk about the difference between a series and a serial, because I think they're slightly different, although there's kind of overlap. So for me, like a series is where you have a bunch of sort of fairly standalone things that are maybe connected in some way. So you see this a lot in crime fiction novels where you'll have maybe recurring characters, but each novel is, you can just read it in any order, doesn't really matter. It's more maybe the setting or the tone of it and some kind of ensemble cast holds it together. Like, classic Agatha Christie or Lee Child stuff, that kind of thing. Or even movies, like if traditionally most movies, if they have sequels, there's a series of films. You're right there.
My lip is falling down. Sorry about that.
I thought you were under attack from some insect or something.
I wouldn't be surprised. Go ahead. Keep going.
Um, so yeah, that's kind of like what I was thinking in terms of a series, where you've got like a collection of things that kind of sit together in some way, but you can kind of approach them in any order. They don't form a larger story in that direct way. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. I
whereas
was thinking, I think my one thing that people are going to find in this is that it's hard not to talk about serials without talking about TV. Because a lot of the
yeah,
examples I was thinking of today were TV, as far as like how to tell the difference. And I was thinking about how, like, the X-Files, for example, feels like the perfect example of a series where you
mm,
have each episode can kind of stand alone. Like if you were just, for the most part, I know some of the later seasons of the X-Files, there were some more through lines and things like that. But like early on, I think it was very monster of the week. You could just watch it as a single thing and there would be characters that carry over, but it's, versus something like Breaking Bad. Again, it's episodic in the sense that each episode has an arc, but you really do need to watch the whole show to understand what's
Yeah.
going on. Like if you came in the middle of Breaking Bad, you'd be like, I don't know who any of these people are,
Yeah.
So
Whereas, yeah, if someone halfway through season 1 of X Files were like, "Oh, I'm watching this thing. It's really cool. You should watch it," you could just turn on the next episode, and
yeah,
it has everything you need to understand it and get started.
yeah, which I think was very much like, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, but like very much the storytelling of a certain time period was like, because you've missed it and the only way you're going to be able to watch it again is if you get it on DVD or something. You had to watch it as it was happening. So they designed it that way so that you could
Hmm.
just see it. So that to me is what says a series versus, yeah, like a serial being a continuous story that you have to follow the whole thing. Otherwise, you're going to be very lost. And Lost is probably another one. There you go.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that observation, actually, that if you think back to sort of pre-2000s, I suppose, like TV from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the 90s was more like just an episodic series where you could hop in at any point. Episodes were not related. It would usually reset at the end of the episode, so there was not a huge amount of sort of character progression.
Mm,
From, you could watch an episode in season 1 or season 4 of something, and everything would kind of be the same. Um, but yeah, what you're saying about how, because you couldn't, like before VHS, like literally your one chance was to watch it when it was on TV, and if you missed it, that was it. So that the idea of trying to follow a story that continued through multiple episodes just was pretty much impossible. Which is why you would still get maybe like some kind of prestige miniseries, but that would be 4 episodes or 6 episodes or something, because then people can commit to doing that. But anything longer than that back then was incredibly difficult.
yeah.
And I think the X Files is a really interesting example, because that kind of landed at a point where TV was starting to shift and experiment. So you would get those occasional episodes that would be driving the kind of larger plot arc forward, and as it went along, those would become more and more common. But you had some shows that were trying to do that, some to greater or lesser extent, whereas a lot of other stuff would just remain completely episodic. And yeah, it didn't matter how you approached it. But then by the time you get to kind of the mid 2000s, everything was shifting towards more of a serial approach, where, whether it was, the stuff I was watching was like Heroes and Lost and Battlestar Galactica and all the sci-fi stuff. And by that point, that had all gone to kind of a long form manner of structuring the story, where if you jumped in halfway through, it'd be quite confusing and you had to go back to the start. But by then, you could very easily buy DVD box sets, and
Right.
online streaming was sort of starting to be a thing. And as those technologies became more common, so did that form of storytelling.
Yeah. It's interesting when my husband and I watched through Fringe because I hadn't seen it before. And he had seen it, but it had been a long time. And it's really interesting watching TV shows from that era uh in the time when you can now binge, right? Where you can watch things
Mm,
back to back, because the structuring is so interesting, because they're trying to, previously on Fringe, and they're trying to give you some kind of anchor to hold on to,
yeah.
for the people who just tuned in or who forgot from last week. They don't remember what happened. It doesn't feel as natural of a story, because they're constantly having to kind of reorient the reader or the watcher, right, into who these people are. Which is why I think sitcoms, I was thinking about this morning, sitcoms rely so heavily on character tropes and character dynamics being really obvious,
Yeah.
because when you turn on Seinfeld or Frasier or whatever, the first few minutes sets up, here's the conflict of this episode. Here's the personalities of these people. You come into Frasier, and Frasier and his brother are sitting at the coffee shop and they're in their suits and they you can tell everything about them from the first few frames of an episode, right? Because the point is you have 20 minutes to understand these people and then it's over,
Yeah. Yeah.
Versus like, in some of these more serialized TV shows, it takes episodes and episodes of development and arcs, and you allow characters to build and grow and be different. So
Yeah.
yeah, it is
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, and that that kind of more 90s style of comedy as well. Like a lot of the humor comes through the repetition. So like with something like Frasier, you get to know the characters so that in any given situation that is occurring in a new episode, you already sort of know how the characters are going to react, and that's
Right.
what makes it compelling and funny because you're looking forward to what is about to happen based on what you know of those characters. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, no, it's really curious. And like a show I was into in the 90s a lot was Babylon 5. And that was interesting because that was sort of mid 90s, 95 onwards. And that was trying really hard to bring in like proper serial storytelling, much more than any other sci-fi at the time. And it got more and more intensive to doing that as it went along. But it was interesting seeing it attempting to do that in the model of television that existed at the time. And a bit like you were saying, like they would spend a lot of time recapping, or characters would have dialogue to each other where they're like, well, as you know, blah, 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 and then say stuff
Yeah.
that they wouldn't need to say. And it's interesting these days how in Netflix or Amazon or Disney serials, you get a bit less of that. Like it feels more confident that people are going to watch from the start and watch through it as you go.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's something interesting there about how technology forces creators to do certain things that are maybe annoying or restrictive, but then as a result lead to an interesting art form emerging out the other end. And then
Right.
as the tech then continues to change, what does that mean? Because a lot of those series formats that we've talked about from like the 80s and 90s, like they don't exist in quite the same way anymore. But just
Right.
because television doesn't work like it used to doesn't mean that those types of stories aren't still really good.
Well, not to get, hopefully this doesn't take us too off topic, but it'll be quick. I do kind of wonder how much this new, like, what would you call it? Directive of Netflix that the writers need to simplify the writing because they assume people are going to be scrolling at the same
Yeah.
time. It does kind of make you wonder, like, is that going to have another swing of the pendulum back another direction where we will start seeing more of that kind of recap style TV? Because it's kind of like, well, we have to keep explaining it over again, not because we're assuming you haven't watched it, but because we're assuming you're not paying attention. It's like,
Mm.
I don't know. Might be interesting to find out. But
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And that's interesting because it's sort of an external audience behavior thing imposing itself rather than the like broadcast
yeah.
itself being the influencer. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, yes, we could get into a whole other conversation about that style of writing, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think hopefully that kind of explains the difference as we see it between like series and serials and those slightly different but related forms of storytelling. So yeah, I think the simplest way of defining a serial is that it's essentially a single work of some sort split into lots of little bits.
Mhm.
And that when you put all those little bits together, you get a cohesive single thing. And I discovered a word this week, which is, I'm not entirely confident in how you say it, but I think you say fascicle. I'd never heard this word before, but apparently back in the day, a fascicle is the word for like a small piece of a story or a collection that would form like a poetry collection or something. So yeah, I'm going to try and make fascicle a thing so that
Yeah.
we're in our publishing of serial fiction, we're not publishing chapters because they're not quite chapters, and they're not really episodes because that's a bit TV-ish. So can everyone start using fascicle, please?
Yeah. We got to bring
Yeah,
it back.
thanks. Scoot just stuck it in the chat just so that everyone knows how to
Perfect.
type it. I think that's what it means. If I've got it horrendously wrong, I think we should just go with it anyway.
Yeah.
And language evolves. We can just make it mean what we want it to mean.
Yep.
Um, yes.
I like
Exactly. So yeah, historically then, and don't know what my camera just did. Got very excited and zoomed in on my face. Um, but yeah, historically, like where serials came from and how they came to be, because it's quite interesting. I mean, it's quite interesting if you're me anyway, um, and probably you, Sally, because I think we're
I,
both nerdy enough about this kind of stuff. But it's interesting to see why and how serials came about, and then sort of went away, at least in terms of literature, and now has come back, and it's sort of come back through the advent of the internet, but also is sort of exactly the same as it was hundreds of years ago, and it's fulfilling the same purpose. So yeah, in my brief googling about to remind myself of some of this stuff, like serial fiction was around from the very start of publishing, basically, because making books was really hard and really expensive, like in the early days. Um, we're talking like 17th century type stuff here. But it was much easier to make like a little pamphlet or just like really small little things that you'd put out or publish in, small form. You could test if people liked it, and if people liked it, you could then start collecting these things together, and then you'd have a book. And yeah, that was a thing from the very start. And when I was reading about this, it sounded exactly like why people do this these days as well. In that you're not quite sure if anyone's going to like your story, so you put it out chapter by chapter, and then you try and build an audience with the eventual goal of perhaps selling it as a book. So in a lot of ways, absolutely nothing has changed in the last 400 years or something. But yeah, and I think it's funny because when I started writing serial fiction, I sort of thought it was a newish thing that had appeared with the internet. I think like back in 2014, 2015, I was like, oh, this is a fun way to write, that you can send out chapters to people over the internet. And I didn't fully appreciate at the time, I don't think, that it had been around for ages and actually sort of predated like the novel.
yeah. Well, I was even thinking like there are certain storytelling traditions going way back even before print where, you know, during the winter or like during the cold months, people would gather in at one person's house and somebody would be the storyteller and they would tell stories over successive nights because the whole point is you're trying to pass the time while it's cold outside and you can't farm and you
Hmm.
can't do any of the things you're supposed to do. And I mean that's serial fiction. Like it might look a little different and be structured a little different, but I think it is very much a human thing to to want to draw people through a longer narrative, you know. Um and I love the idea that like yeah, humans haven't really changed that much because I'm sure some of those early serializers in publishing were probably like, yeah, I mean, I want to be able to tell this story. I can't afford to tell it the way that I want to tell it. So let's just cut out the middleman and I'll just send out these pages little by little and see how this goes, you know? And it's like, that's basically what we're all doing.
Yeah,
So,
no, exactly. And you got challenging literacy levels, and people are busy and have to go and like plow the farm or whatever, and
yeah.
don't have time to read like a whole book. Like, who's doing that? That'd be a weird thing to do in 500 years ago. But they might read a little small snippet of a story. That's the thing that could happen. So yeah, little quiet kind of early starts. But again, it was like, it was a technology driven thing, or like a lack of technology, and the challenging like production processes meant that it was just easier to put out little fascicles here and there. So that's how it kicked off. But then it was really 19th and 20th century when it got really big. So it went from being a kind of purely practical thing, I suppose, to being actually the main way stories were being published in print. And it was like the way to do it. And the publication of fiction in magazines would drive subscriptions to that magazine. Like they would be the main driver for that thing. And, the example that everyone always gives is obviously Charles Dickens and Pickwick Papers and some of his stuff. That seems, I think, like when you Google serial fiction, I think Dickens must just come up because he's always mentioned. Like whenever serial fiction is coming up, people are like, "Oh, Charles Dickens, yes."
Well, and also
Um,
Conan Doyle. People talk about Arthur Conan Doyle a lot too.
Yeah, that's the thing. And then you dig into it and you realize that actually, like all the big authors from the
Yeah.
period were doing serial fiction in some way. So you got Dickens, you got Arthur Conan Doyle, Henry James, I have a list here. Um, in France, you had like Alexandre Dumas doing his stuff that way. The Count of Monte Cristo, I think, was actually everyone was doing it. And again, it became the way to build an audience and then also have a cool book at the end of it. But allegedly, the reason a lot of 19th century books are quite chunky is because they started life as serials, and because the writer was getting paid by the line and by the chapter, they were like, well, I'll add some extra chapters and just keep this thing going because then I get paid loads. Uh, and that then resulted in longer books. So it wasn't because people were writing long books, it's because they were writing long serials that then got turned into books.
Yeah.
Um,
Also, I do love whenever we can disabuse ourselves of the notion that, they knew they were writing classics. They were writing
yeah,
what paid. So,
yeah,
and they turned out to be classics, which we're all grateful for. But it is
hmm
kind of funny. At the time,
yeah.
they were thinking about.
No, they were just trying to get the biggest audience they possibly could. Like it was absolutely like popular fiction. Um,
Yeah.
and it's
Mama
interesting how then
Carol in the chat, Mama Carol said Mark Twain as well, which here in America,
yes,
Mark Twain very
yeah,
popularly did serials. Yeah.
yeah. Because I think in America it started off with the magazines publishing a lot of British writers.
Mm.
Yeah, Dickens and Conan Doyle, but then obviously American writers were like, this is a good idea, and got in on it. And yeah, it's interesting how a lot of those books are held up as like classic novels when like they never started off as novels. Like
Right.
the novel was like the box set at the end of it. That was like a convenient collection, so that people didn't have to like go through a million magazines to read the story again.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the original form, and I feel like it's. I mean, Dickens always comes up as the example, but despite that, I don't like at school when I was reading some of this stuff and learning about it. I don't remember them being talked about in the context of serial fiction and how that was their like original form.
No, and I don't remember ever studying some of those writers knowing that, because I do think that changed a lot about the style of how the finished books look and feel. Like, I know that I think my closest, the one I can think of is some of Conan Doyle's books. And like, it's not super obvious that they were serials, but there are some tells, like when you read back through, especially the way that each Sherlock Holmes book, again, is designed to be very much like, it's okay if you've never read any other Sherlock Holmes books. You can read any of them, really, in any order. Um, and I mean, that to me very much is clearly a signal that he was serializing a lot of these because it was the fun mystery that everyone bought the magazine for. They wanted to see the end of the mystery.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it'd be interesting to go back and study some of those writers, knowing that like there were breaks in between some of those pieces and wondering like, were they at the chapter breaks that we have, or were they broken up differently? I don't know. I'd be curious
Yeah.
to know that.
Yeah, annoyingly, I can't remember which Dickens it is. Someone in chat might, but there's a Dickens novel that it changes perspective, like
Mm,
narrative narrator, quite significantly at various points, and I believe that's partly because he was just writing it in serial form as he went along, and then he was like, "Oh, actually, it's going to work better if I change this." And if he'd written it as a novel, he'd probably have ironed out a bit of that. But
right.
because it went out as a serial, it was kind of flowing this way and that, as these things tend to happen. Where I think when you're writing a serial, it depends how you do it a little bit, but they do have a habit of forcing you to make interesting creative choices that you have to then commit to, and you're stuck with them for good or ill in some way.
Yeah. It's comforting to know that even Dickens had continuity issues because
Yeah, exactly.
that plagues all of us.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to think that a lot of these books that became classics and are still read today, hundreds of years later, came about through a process that then went away,
Mm.
pretty much. like that way of writing and publishing and then becoming a novel eventually for a long time until the last sort of 20 years in a way, as a popular way of writing and publishing disappeared. And a bit like what we were saying about TV, actually, that because of the way television consumption has changed, some of the forms of TV you'd get in the 80s and 90s and very early 2000s, you don't see it so much anymore because you don't have like network TV and scheduled TV in quite the same way. And then unfortunately, that means that some of those types of thing disappear as well.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether that happened with literature, in that when you look at the body of work from the period, and you if you get people going, oh well, books aren't like they used to be in the 19th century. It's like it's not just because tastes have changed, but it's because people stopped being able to write in a serial way and then publish it that way around.
Yeah. Yeah. And it kind of makes you wonder how much that's changed even the nature of every ancillary thing around publishing, editing. I mean, as an editor, I think about that a lot, where it's like when you're the editor at a magazine editing each individual piece of a Charles Dickens story to then publish to make sure it reads properly, that's very different than when you're given a manuscript, and you have to edit it for this publisher. I think about how that must have changed pretty much everything about the tone and the content and all the things that people were exposed to. Even I just kind of I don't know. These are the things I wonder about. And to me, serials do have an air of freedom about them. I'm sure that there was some content control going on in the magazines and stuff like that. I'm sure they wanted certain things that would kind of play properly to the right audiences. But at the same time, um, I think there's a democratization of storytelling that is kind of inherent serial style, where it's like
Mhm.
everyone sit down and listen. I'm going to just like give you this thing, which we've carried forward now into the internet. But yeah, it's like where it's not new. This desire to freely tell a story that doesn't have to go through a gatekeeper first.
Yeah,
Actually, Jonathan Reed just said our radio drama is also serial fiction. I would say in some cases, yeah, like some of
yeah.
them probably for sure.
Well,
Um,
this is the interesting thing. So it was it was the way that literature was done back in the 19th and early 20th century, and not just in the US and the UK. It was apparently like very common through Europe, in Russia, China, basically like everywhere. Serial fiction was the way it was done. Again, probably because everyone was just figuring out how to do publishing, and they were like, "This seems slightly easier. We'll do it this way." Um, but then, you hit the 20th century, and again, technology comes along and interferes in interesting ways, and you get radio dramas and movies and television dramas like slightly later on, and serial fiction just sort of leaves literature at a certain point and just goes into those forms. Uh, which is it's a really weird thing to have happened, because you can see why they would have expanded into like radio and then TV, because those are great forms for doing serial fiction. But I'm still curious as to why it stopped being a thing in publishing.
right.
And it could partly be because publishing technology got better, so it was just easier, cheaper to publish books. It wasn't, such a tricky thing to do. Certainly longer books became able to be produced more easily, I think.
Well, yeah, if you think
Um,
about a mass market paperback being comparable in price to a magazine, then what's the reason why should I subscribe to a magazine that has I mean, I'm sure that was still happening, but like why should I pay the same price to subscribe to a magazine versus just buying the finished book to read on the beach or in the airplane or whatever? Like I have now, I can just own it versus having to wait, which is
yeah,
just interesting. Like you don't have to wait now to finish the story. It's right here.
no. Although people are still having that conversation about, well, why would I pay to subscribe to a writer when I could pay to subscribe to this magazine? So maybe it's kind of flipped the other way around. But yeah,
I feel like that's a topic we're definitely going to cover in one of these episodes.
yeah, we'll get into that more at some point.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, serial fiction like has always been around basically, but it hopped out of literature and went into audio and visual. Um, the exception being comics, where it then got picked up with like the early sort of superhero stuff and a lot of the sort of detective and crime things, and you know a lot of the pulp comics was doing serial fiction, and then Marvel and DC went quite heavily into that route where you know the comic storylines would carry on for ages and ages, still are going, I suppose, in some ways. And then in the 80s, I guess you then had comics kind of shift a little bit into stuff like Watchmen, for example, where rather than like with something like Batman, it's serial fiction, but it's also kind of going on forever, a bit more like a soap opera, I suppose. Whereas with something like Watchmen, it was like, no, this is X number of chapters which we're putting out as issues, and then at the end of it, it becomes a graphic novel, and that's now a book. Which is, you know, that's what novels were doing 100 years earlier. So yeah, but I'm just kind of mystified by the fact that literature and it all became all about the novel. Basically, like you'd still get short stories, like you'd have short story competitions, and they'd get published in magazines occasionally, but the whole concept of serial fiction in print, other than comics, sort of vanished for decades, as far as I'm aware, anyway.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are underground movements and certain periodicals that are still happening and stuff like that. These things always tend to survive in some way or another, but yeah, I do think it is interesting. I don't even know if you want to call it a sociological phenomenon of like not wanting to have to wait for the next thing. I never really thought about it that way before this conversation, but just, yeah, like if you can just buy the book, then there's no, then you get to decide, you get to dole out the chapters on your terms, okay, just
Yeah,
one more chapter tonight. But if you don't have access to that, and I mean, along with that, again, if there just isn't money in publishing that way, in having a magazine that breaks things up that way, um I think probably the closest like long running literary tradition of that would be some of the children's magazines. I remember when I was a kid, I want to say there was a magazine called Firefly. There's one called, I think, Highlights or something. There were some of these like kid magazines that would have serial fiction in them, which I'm only just realizing, they were really simple, just like, one little column. But it was the kind of thing where like you had to keep buying the magazines in order to keep
yeah,
reading the stories. Um, but yeah, I wonder if there wasn't a financial incentive to do it that way. Um,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
which
That
is a bummer, but
yeah, and that kind of desire to just have the thing rather than being given it slowly over time. Can I do a really hot take, which just popped into my head? So like through the 20th century, there's television, movies, they became popular culture, and while reading and literature and novels like was always there and was always sold well and stuff, it kind of existed in a slightly different place. Like it was movies and TV and comics and then video games that get the kind of the big flashy showbiz excitement, and literature is sort of over here, and like we all love literature and books and all that kind of stuff, but it didn't have the cachet that it maybe had in the 19th century, where you'd have these like superstar authors in that way. Um, I wonder, is that partly perhaps because the serial storytelling went away and it became just the book? Because as soon as you have like a single big thing you can just buy, it's a lot harder to have conversations about that thing because like you have to wait for everyone else to have read the whole book before you can talk about it. And you don't want to spoil it by talking about it ahead of time. And then if you've read it, but none of your friends have read it yet, then all you can really say is, oh, you should read that book. And it kind of stifles the conversation. Whereas with something that's published as a serial, it's really easy for everyone to just read that week's chapter. And then everyone's aligned and is at the exact same point in the story. And that's what television was doing. And it's what comics were doing. It's what movies were doing. A movie is 2 hours, and then when the sequel comes out, everyone goes and sees the sequel at the same time. And I just wonder if that's why it was then really easy, because when you went into work the next day or into school the next day, you knew that you could all talk about that same thing. And you had that kind of shared cultural experience, which with novels is harder because everyone's coming at it at different points in time. And now, with the streaming platforms, where they're just splurging out all this content all the time, and they'll drop like an entire season all in one go. But the problem there is that you get into the problem that maybe literature had in the 20th century, which is that if a new Stranger Things season appears all in one go, you get some people who binge it straight away. You get other people who just have busier lives or what have you, or are watching it now and again. And you're back in that situation where you suddenly can't talk about it, because if you go to work the next day or go into school, someone's watched the entire season, someone else has watched 2 episodes, you've not watched anything yet. And it kind of kills the shared cultural experience thing, which is why maybe nowadays, although there's more TV, more movies, like there's a bajillion hours of Star Wars and Marvel stuff, but it doesn't really have cultural impact in the way it used to. And I wonder if that's part of it.
I think you're right. I think the water cooler effect. No, I think you're absolutely spot on. I think the water cooler effect is a huge deal. It's you're all sharing the same moment in time or the same moment in a narrative. And I tend to think the missing piece in anything is relationship. Like when we lose that relational piece of something like that, it does change the dynamic that we have with a story. Because you're right. Like, I think the closest I've felt that lately was when I went to go see Project Hail Mary with a friend of mine. And it feels like so many people are also, and that's not even a serial story, that's just like a movie, but just we're all kind of having this shared feeling of like, that was awesome, and I really enjoyed it. I know maybe not everybody did, but I did. And I think that's what you're right. Serial storytelling gathers a group of people who are all following at the same time. And that's a very different experience than, oh, I've read that book and you've read that book. We can talk about it. And actually, when you think about even just time-wise, decades-wise, there's probably this couple of decades sweet spot before the internet where how would you find fellow fans of something? I guess maybe comic books would be easier because you could hang out at comic book shops and you could meet fellow fans of stuff or mail order. I'm sure they had mail-in kind of fan clubs and stuff like that. But how would you find fellow fans of a product that you liked? Is probably really challenging. And then of course the internet shows up and now it's like, oh, I can find all of the people who love this one niche thing that I love, and I think that definitely is I would say, I think you're right. I think that's a huge aspect of what gets traded when we trade out different kinds of storytelling.
Yeah. I think the aspect of that I'd not really considered before was that the publishing industry, by sort of jettisoning the serial model in favor of just novels and publishing, it was publishing fiction has been about novels for the last 70 years or whatever. I just wonder whether that's a factor in why it's rarer to have conversations about that kind of thing. I don't know. Possibly. Need to think about it more. But the other thing that was interesting is that in the 90s, 80s and 90s, there were some big name authors who were trying to serialize stuff.
Mm.
So there were kind of like one-off little experiments that happened. Like Stephen King did it a few times. Um, who else? I wrote some stuff down. I think Tom Wolfe did it. Michael Chabon did it as well. But in those cases, those were big enough names that if they were doing like a quirky, weird thing like serializing their next book before it became a book, people were going to go and dig it out. But I imagine, other than experimenting, they probably sort of hoped it would bring back that form as a more common, regular thing, but it never quite did. Um, Probably because the publishing houses treated it as like a marketing quirk or a stunt of some sort, rather than a legitimate thing in its own right.
Well, and it's different. Yeah, the relationship is different when it is an author that they already knew that there would be a fan presence for that. Like they're
Mhm.
probably not going to take a chance on someone they've never heard of because you know who wants to read Joe Schmo's serial that no one's ever heard of, right? Um,
Tell me about it.
but that's just it. Is like I think that's so much of it, and like it's going to be the specter hanging over this whole conversation. But like so much of it is about profit and about how publishers can make money. Um, and I just imagine it's easier to market and package and sell. And I want to be clear, I have nothing against traditional publishing. I really don't. I think that there definitely are positives to it. It's a big deal for a reason, right? But I think though that we're kidding ourselves if we don't think that it's all driven by how can we get the most money as easy as possible. And I bet serials just don't. They're just harder to market, they're harder to package, they're harder to um price. Like I don't even know, like if you're not running a magazine, how do you price
Yeah.
serials? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
The infrastructure around it had gone. So
Yeah.
it's not like if authors wanted to do it in the 90s, like unless you're Stephen King, like there's no way to do it really.
Right.
Um, which I suppose brings us to the 2000s and the 2010s and now, and what has happened in this century, um, which is the internet, which again, technology coming along and doing weird stuff. Uh, yeah, the internet arrived and kind of, I think the way I kind of see it happening is it kind of kickstarted fan fiction
Mhm.
in a ridiculously like just stratospheric way, which is very very kind of niche thing. But it's a bit like what you were saying about being at high school with your friends and just sharing bits of story back and forth. And
Yeah.
people had always done that, but all of a sudden they could do it online and they could uh, write stories set in their favorite uh, fictional worlds and share them with each other. And that's basically serial fiction, but in a kind of like very lo-fi amateur, sharing enthusiasm kind of way. Then you had systems like Wattpad appeared to kind of create a infrastructure around that. And again, very much started as a fan fiction thing, but then inevitably over time, and if it was teenagers who were doing that initially, fast forward 5 years, those teenagers are now young adults and are maybe wanting to write some other stuff, not just the fan fiction, and suddenly they're writing legit serial fiction. And then you have the explosion of all these kind of new platforms, and obviously you've got blogs happening at the same time where people can just DIY it and do it themselves. Uh, and then fast forward again, and you've got stuff like Kickstarter and Patreon appearing, where you start to get the economic model component being attached to the whole thing. And then you get to now where you have stuff like Substack and Ghost and Beehive, where people can create mailing lists of people who want to read their stuff and send it out directly. And uh, serial fiction is all of a sudden like a thing again.
Yeah.
And it's all because technology has come along and taken us way back to like 400 years earlier.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think too, like the culture around writing. Like I remember when I was in high school was when it probably was a little bit earlier than that, but when I first really became aware of NaNoWriMo as well, which
Yeah.
I just think NaNoWriMo, a sore subject these days because there's a lot of things going on with that, but I think it really can't be overstated how much NaNoWriMo unlocked a lot of people's desire to write and kind of put it in the hands of people that like 50,000 words sounds like a lot, but you can actually do this in 30 days. And um, I know that's not necessarily connected to serial fiction, but I actually think in some ways that there's some shared DNA there of people jumping into something like NaNoWriMo and then thinking, well, now I have this thing, what do I do with it? Like,
Hmm.
do I try to publish it? What do I do? And I know of several people who started just sharing the stories they wrote it on during NaNoWriMo, just whatever way they could, you know? And I think it gave some shared language around writing. I still think I know plotter and pantser might be an older term than NaNoWriMo, but I really think NaNoWriMo made it popular. There's just a lot of like shared kind of internet lingo around writing that has a direct tie back to NaNoWriMo, which is really interesting. So, um, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting to kind of see that really surge in that early
Hmm.
2000s time period.
Yeah. I'd not. Yeah, I'd sort of slightly overlooked that, but that's a really good point because I think it also normalized the idea of sharing your work
Mhm.
and it not having to be perfect, and like you
Yeah.
don't have to be the best writer being published by a big publishing house with a perfect book on a shelf. Like anyone can write and you can put it out there. It doesn't mean that people are going to read it necessarily, but it's okay to write and put it out. And if people come along, they do. If they don't, they don't. Um, but yeah, you can definitely, I think, draw a line, like you say, to kind of the more serial. I mean, I did NaNoWriMo, I think 5 years before I started serializing,
Mm.
and if I hadn't done that, I don't think I'd have had the confidence to then try doing the serials like a few years later, which is probably the case for loads of people. Um,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
and, and and I think the interest. So go on.
I just the quote, I forget who said the quote, a famous person whose name has escaped me, but the "Don't get it right, just get it written." I think that was kind of the motto of NaNoWriMo, and I think there's a lot of people who took that to heart with the serializing, that idea that,
Yeah,
like, just write it down, get it out there.
yeah. And I think it's interesting because yeah, the NaNoWriMo thing of you've got 1 month, you got to do 50K. Don't worry about how good it is. You just got to do it. And I think that proved to a lot of people that they could actually just write some words.
Yeah.
And then if you sort of extend that to the serial format that you might find on Wattpad or on Substack with people doing it via newsletter, it's sort of stretching that out. So it's like, okay, well, instead of a month and trying to write that much in a month, which is rarely going to result in something that is good. It could be
Mm.
really important and then become something good down the line, but like it's really hard to write something really good in at that pace. But instead, what if you write a chapter every week and then put that out in serial form, and all of a sudden the equation changes, and actually that one chapter could be all right. And you're
Yeah.
kind of tweaking the variables to keep having that social, like light social pressure and momentum, but with a higher quality end result.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, there's definitely a connection there. Hmm. Yeah, interesting. But yeah, and that's that kind of leads us to where we are, I suppose. Um, I think like we're going to start straying into our later chats if we're not too careful. But
Yeah.
what I thought might be quite fun is just to think about like what is the first serial fiction that you can kind of remember engaging with, like no matter how young you were or whenever it is. But like, what would you say is like the first bit of serial fiction that actually like meant something?
I thought of a couple, but
Mm.
uh the first one that I really thought of as being truly serial fiction um was there were these mini series that aired on ABC back in the late 90s, maybe. And they were classic stories. There was four of them that I remember properly because my we have them on DVD. My parents still have them on DVD. It was Merlin and Arabian Nights and Gulliver's Travels and Alice in Wonderland, right? and they were all-star casts, like stacked. Like they were amazing. These were very well done considering they were made for TV movies, and they were aired over subsequent evenings, primetime slots in the evenings. And um I remember watching them in real time as a kid and being fascinated by this idea of like, you have to stop at a certain point and I have to wait until tomorrow to watch the next
Hmm.
part, like,
Yeah.
um, and there was Arabian Nights was actually perfect for that because there's actually a line that Scheherazade says at the end of one of the episodes. She's like, tomorrow night, you just have to wait till tomorrow night. Just like, oh, hey, I get it. um, yeah, and actually, those are still you can still watch those on Tubi. I think they're available to watch. But that was the first kind of like serial fiction I remember clocking as being in installments. And then I think as
Mhm.
far as a TV show that I remember engaging with early on would be Alias. I love
Okay. Yep.
Alias
Yep.
as a young person, and that one to me is very much a serial, like a fairly true serial, because even though each episode is kind of a mission, that this spy is on, there definitely it's a full story, from beginning to end. So yeah, that was the two that clocked into my head. But yeah.
Nice. Yeah. No, Alias that came along right at this when TV was kind of making that sudden switch
Yeah.
into doing that more
Yeah.
serialized form of storytelling. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I think for me, so because I was thinking back to when I was like really young, where most of what I was doing was well, like reading or watching would have been series rather than serials. So, it would be like Hardy Boys books or Agatha Christie books and yeah, that kind of thing. Um, but when I was thinking back, I think the earliest example I could think of was the 1980s Transformers comic, uh, and particularly the UK, because the UK had like a whole bunch of extra stories for weird reasons, written by someone called Simon Furman, who, given that this was effectively a toy tie-in designed to sell toys to kids, like the comic started when I was 5, I think.
Yeah.
So it's essentially an advert, but Simon Furman, the writer, took it really seriously.
Hmm.
I don't know why he did, but like my young brain massively appreciated it. And retrospectively, like I can see that was when I was just completely in love with that form of storytelling because the comic ran for like 6 years or something. So, when you're 5 and then that comic still exists and you're reading it when you're like 10 or 11 and then it ends, that's a
Yeah.
big chunk of your life.
That's
But
formative.
the key, yeah, exactly. But the key thing is that stuff that happened in the comic in 1986 would be relevant years later. And that was a pretty mad thing to do for a kid's comic back then. Um, but I think in my brain, I was like, "Oh, this is exciting! Like, I love the idea of this like long running thing, and that something that I read years ago
Yeah.
is relevant now, years later." And and then in the 90s, on TV, it was Babylon 5 for me, which was like really pushing what what could be done in the TV format, and then you sort of saw that in the 2000s go into every other TV thing. But I think for me, in both of those, something that was really critical was that kind of time aspect. So the idea that you could read something or watch an episode, and then 4 years later, something would happen in the continuing serial story that would link back to that thing you did earlier. And I'm still kind of fascinated by that temporal aspect of serial fiction, where if you just get the collection in a book and you read it in like a couple of weeks or something, like you get the same story, but it's not quite the same as if you've lived with those characters and the story and themes for actual years of your life. Yeah, that gives it a real resonance that I think you can only get from serial fiction.
Yeah, that buildup of callbacks and yeah, of themes being able to echo as it goes. Yeah, that there is something really powerful about that you just don't get from something that's truly episodic, or even something that, and again, this we'll probably get into this later, but like something that's more like a novel broken into chapters.
Mhm.
You can get a bit of that, But serials are they're slightly different in that sense that, there is this feeling of building familiarity over time, and it pays off in tiny ways and then also in big ways. And it's fun to be able to bring, again, it's the relationship piece, like bring readers along with you in that and build that community around the thing enough that people will recognize the little motifs or the winks and nods and go, I know
Yeah.
what that is, or I know where that came from. Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah, there's a reward for paying attention, I think.
Yeah.
And the fact that you can read the same like if someone comes along and reads Tales from the Triverse now, it's the same story, but it's going to be a different experience to being there for the ride as I wrote it and went along. And
Yeah.
I think being able to go on that journey with the creator of the thing, whether it's a TV show uh, or prose fiction or what have you, that's just very exciting stuff.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. Well, should we wrap it up thereabouts?
Yeah.
We could probably talk for another 2 hours,
I
but
mean, yeah. But we will in install in
exactly.
fast.
We have to end on a cliffhanger, right? So yeah, next time I think the plan is loosely anyway to talk about kind of planning and prep and how we approach that part of it. Like before we actually start publishing a serial, what are we doing? How long do we plan for? How do we figure out what the serial is going to be and tips and we'll get much more into kind of practical tips and craft stuff.
Yeah.
Now that
Nitty
we've
gritty.
laid the foundation. Yeah,
Yeah. Exactly.
exactly. Nice. Excellent. Well, thanks everyone for coming along. You're a very chatty bunch.
Yeah.
Substack doesn't save the chat, does it? Which I always think it's a bit
No,
sad.
but there's been an awful lot of craziness going on down there. I've sort of been peeking in every once in a while.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
exactly. But yeah, we haven't scheduled in the next one yet. But it will probably be early June, I think, because there's school holidays coming up in the UK. So I'll be out of action for a week. But then we'll get going after that.
yeah.
And yeah, we'll stick the recording of this up as well, so that if you really enjoyed it, you can watch it all over again.
Yeah. Tune in next time, as they say.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, we should have done some kind of foreshadowing that will pay off in later
Yeah.
episodes. That would have been good. Maybe we do.
Find out why my books were falling over.
Yeah. I think every episode, something dramatic has to happen off screen.
Yes.
That
The precedent is
people can,
set.
like in the mirror in the background, people can start to figure out maybe what's going on.
Exactly.
Sounds good. Brilliant. All right, Sally, thank you very much. Actually,
Thank
do you want to just, for anyone watching who mysteriously doesn't know what you do you want to just quickly say where people can find you and what's going on?
Yes, my name is Essie Reed on Substack, Sally in real life. I write fiction over at Tailbones and nonfiction in other places. You can look at my other newsletters. I have a few books published, a couple of short story collections, and a novella that started out as a serial here on Substack. But yeah, I'm around. I'm editing a couple of my serials into a novel right now, so that's the exciting thing going on for me. And yeah, I'm always lurking on notes. So feel free
Nice.
to tag me anytime.
Excellent. And yeah, my serial Tales from the Triverse wrapped up in January, so the whole thing is on the newsletter. If you can be bothered to click through a million Substack posts, yeah, I'm hopefully going to be doing like a print version of it. But again, it's a lot of words. I don't quite know how to handle it. I'm slightly intimidated by my own manuscript. But yeah, I also write a load of stuff about writing serial fiction, as you may have guessed. But yes, otherwise, we'll see you on the next one of these, which will no doubt shout about lots and try and encourage you to come along. Okay.
Have a good one,
Have a good rest of
everybody.
your day.
Bye.
Bye bye.